Okay, so we're now going to have 4 talks about neuroscience and mathematical cognition, and looking at it from several points of view. So I will be speaking about numerical cognition after brain injury, followed by talks by Karin Kucian, Roy Cohen Kadosh, and Daniel Ansari on some other aspects of neuroscience. This talk is in collaboration with 2 people who couldn't be here today, Esther Gosling and Neely Demeyer. So could you change, we have the next slide? Daniel? Okay, so this talk will be in particular about relations between subitizing and arithmetic. It's, I think, now well known that the human's ability to enumerate visual stimuli involves not only verbal counting, but also 2 non-verbal quantity recognition processes. One is the approximate number system, which involves the approximate estimation of quantities above 3 or 4 items, and the other is subitizing, the ability to make rapid yet accurate number judgments without counting about small sets of stimuli presented in the visual field. And both are considered important, though there are debates about which is more important. Subitizing is generally considered to extend to 3 items in infants and young children and 4 or 5 items in typical adults. Next slide. So in this study, we wanted to look at the relationship between subitizing arithmetic in patients and control participants, and in particular to see whether there were subitizing impairments in the patients and whether these predicted arithmetical difficulties. And this study included a total of 20 adult participants, including 9 patients and 11 controls. The age of the control group ranged from 62 to 80, with a mean age of 65. And the control group consisted of 4 female and 7 male participants. And to be eligible for this group, the participants had to have no history of any known neurological abnormalities. Next slide. So the patient group consisted of 9 participants ranging from age 32 to 80. It included 7 male and 2 female participants, and 8 had strokes, and 1 had posterior cortical atrophy. All the stroke patients were in a chronic stage at least 9 months post-stroke. I have summarized the patient's deficits in this table, and they included 3 patients with right hemisphere lesions, 5 with left hemisphere lesions, and 1 with posterior cortical atrophy on both sides. And they had a variety of cognitive deficits, some indeed, and some had no obvious cognitive deficits. Only 1 had a recorded number processing deficit, but as you can see, several others had number deficits in the tasks. Next slide. So they were given 3 tasks: visual enumeration, including both counting and subitizing, addition and multiplication, and all did the full enumeration experiment but not all completed the full multiplication and addition tasks due to time constraints and the limited capacities and slowness of some patients. Next slide. And ePrime software was used to deliver all the tests and to record all the data. For each condition, participants sat in front of a computer screen and used the keyboard to respond, which was considered the most appropriate method, given that some of the patients had motor control problems and a couple had speech deficits. The space bar was used to record reaction times, and the numeric keypad was used for recording answers. Next slide. And the visual enumeration included randomly positioned gray dots, which varied in number from 1 to 9. Each block consisted of 5 trials per numerosity, thus totaling 45 trials per block, and the dot display remained on the screen and limited duration and only disappeared when participants made a response. Next slide. And they were asked to enumerate the dots on the screen as quickly and accurately as possible. Next slide. And the addition task was made of 2 blocks, each consisting of 64 trials. The numbers used in the equations ranged from 1 to 99, and the experiment consisted of both ascending and descending sums and could either bridge 0, 1, or 2 decades. And we did do some studies of what was most difficult for people, but due to time constraints, I will not only talk about the addition task as a whole. And next slide. Multiplication experiment consisted of 1 block of 64 trials with 8 trials for each multiplication table from 2 to 9. Equation was presented in numerical form. Participants responded as quickly as they could. Next slide. 4 patients completed all 64 trials, with patient A completing a shortened version due to her slowness and time constraints. A total of 7 controls completed it fully. Next slide. So the subitizing accuracy data for visual enumeration was the average of scores from 1 to 3 dots. The subitizing slope being taken as the step size between response to 2 and 3 dots. To analyze the counting data, a reaction time slope was calculated across the counting range using a linear regression. This range was considered to involve numbers 5 to 8, and the maximum display number of 9 was excluded as responses to this display may have been affected by int guessing. Next slide. And the traditional way to assess the efficacy of subitizing and counting is to compare response time slopes in each condition and the mean response times for each numerosity shown in figure 1. Next slide. So this is the reaction, the time to correct answers. And as we can see, there is quite a lot of variation in general speed of responses. Reaction time usually goes up with numerosity, and the control, and several patients were quite similar to the control group, though some were much slower. Next slide. And a matched pairs t-test was used in both groups to test the hypothesis that subitizing was quicker than counting. And in the patients group, counting speed was indeed significantly slower than subitizing, i.e. there was significantly faster response to numbers 1, 2, 3 than to larger numbers, but rather unexpectedly, no significant difference was found for the controls. Next slide. And there was actually no significant correlation between subitizing speed and addition response time, either in the patient group or in the control group or in the groups combined. There was also no significant correlation between subitizing accuracy and addition accuracy. Next slide. And we then looked at whether patients had significantly different performance to the controls. So to analyze the individual patient data point that fell outside this range, we calculated the normal range for each task for the controls, and then ran a Crawford's t-test on each of the outlying data points to see if the patient's performance was significantly different from controls. Next slide. Well, I will not go into great detail with this slide. It shows the range and the average and standard deviation for the controls. If people are interested in this in more detail, you please ask me or email me. But the main point is that we did calculate these and were therefore able to look at patients' deviations from these. Next slide. So we showed a table of the significant differences shown by each patient from the controls, and thus their impairments in the next slide. 3 patients didn't differ from controls in any measure. Those who did showed a variety of deficits. 4 patients showed deficits in subitizing speed or accuracy, and 2 of these combined their subitizing deficits with a number of arithmetical deficits, these being P and A, while 2 others, N and E, had only subitizing deficit. Some other patients didn't have subitizing deficits at all, but in some cases had other deficits, and in the case of the 3 I mentioned to begin with, had no deficits relative to controls. Next slide. Next slide after this. So to sum up, there was no significant correlation between subitizing or accuracy or speed and performance on any arithmetical task overall. Next slide. So results of this study didn't support the hypothesis that there'd be a relationship in this sample between subitizing and arithmetical performance. It wasn't correlated in the groups, and individual patients with subitizing deficits did not necessarily show arithmetical deficits. A warning against drawing too strong conclusions is that this doesn't necessarily mean that subitizing is not essential to the initial development of mathematical ability. It could be a prerequisite for the development of numerical abilities, but not for their preservation once they've developed. Next slide. So this is the end of this talk, and if people have any questions, they're welcome to ask me. Thank you. I see a hand up. Was Taba?
Yeah. Hi, Anne. Thank you very much for this interesting talk. I'm wondering whether it's possible, based on the plot that I saw, it seems that it should be possible to somehow classify the patients. So it was like 6 of them showed somehow similar pattern, 2 and 1, which was like probably the one who didn't complete and probably has some other issues as well. But I wonder whether it's possible to classify the performance based on their region of deficit that or injury that they have.
We looked at that and we didn't find very much. And for example, we had 2 people, R and P in the list, who had quite similar apparent deficits and both had expressive aphasia. But one patient of these patients, R, had quite limited deficit in specifically for retrieval of multiplication effects, no problems with any other aspect of maths, and whereas P had numerous deficits. So when there's likely to be differences according both to specific aspects of brain damage and also pre-existing individual differences. But rather like Marinella Cappelletti in earlier studies of patients, it did not seem like there's a strict one-to-one relationship between particular brain areas and particular deficits.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
It looks like there's one more question in the chat, but I think we should probably transition. And if you're able to respond to that in chat, or would you rather respond to that in person?
Either is fine. I can respond in chat if it's easier, and we can move on now to Karin Kucian's talk.
Okay, I tried to share my screen. Do you see the slides, the presentation, or the speaker mode?
We see the presenter mode.
Okay, I shared. Sorry, I have to share the other screen then. This one. So now it should be the full presentation, right? Good, perfect. So good afternoon. For me, it's afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to give you some insights in our studies about dyscalculia. Prediction, prevention, and persistence are the topics I'm going to talk today. And go on. In our first study, we were interested whether we can predict which of these young kids will develop severe math problems as we observed them in developmental dyscalculia. So the first goal was to investigate the development and the relationship between numeric and general precursor skills and their predictive value of math achievement later on in the first grade. And to the subjects, we investigated almost 1,900 kindergarten children. They were around 5 years. We tested their number knowledge, IQ, and working memory. We retested these kids 9 months later when they were at the end of the second kindergarten, and for a third time point when they were in first grade, where we evaluated their calculation skills. And the final sample included then 1,600 kids in this study. And here we already see the results. On the top, you have the measurements for IQ, working memory, and number and magnitude knowledge at the first time point in kindergarten. Down here, the same for the second time point, end of kindergarten, and time 3 in first grade, their calculation skills. And I guide you through the most important arrows here. So the main finding was that like the specific number and magnitude skills in kindergarten were the best predictors of later calculation skills. However, we also saw that at the end of kindergarten, IQ and working memory added some predictive value to the development of their calculation skills in school. And what we did not expect was that we saw also an influence of number and magnitude knowledge in first kindergarten regarding their IQ and working memory at the end of kindergarten. So in sum, this first study showed that these are really the specific numerical and magnitude skills in kindergarten that are the most important predictors for later mathematical performance later on in school. And we saw that like high IQ and working memory kind of promotes numerical and magnitude knowledge before school entry. So we think that these kids are in a good starting position for later mathematical achievement in school. On the other hand, we also saw that numerical and magnitude knowledge promotes the establishment of intellectual and memory functions. And here we think that these are rather superior developmental processes which show that children with higher numerical knowledge exposed probably to more demanding problems and train so in parallel their cognitive functions as well. What we saw over the developmental time is that the poor performing children in kindergarten still count to the poor performers in school, although they show individual improvements. And I think it's evident that numerical problems manifest early and lead to difficulties in higher mathematical skills. And so support to improve these numerical and magnitude knowledge of poor performing children in kindergarten seems particularly important. And this leads me already to the next part of the study, where we wanted to investigate whether we can, in any kind, prevent this this negative development. And so, the goal was to evaluate the long-term effects of a preschool training in children that are at risk for developmental dyscalculia. To the study design, we have identified kids in kindergarten that are at risk for developmental dyscalculia. They belonged to the lowest 10% on a numerical task, had no risk for dyslexia and an average IQ. And of these almost 1,900 kids, we could identify 88 children that are at risk for developmental dyscalculia. And with half of these kids at risk, we performed a prevention program. And it's important to note that this prevention program was taking place under conditions that were very close to the kindergarten routine and not like an intervention study with controlled conditions we have in research. For instance, only 50% intervention participation was necessary to be included. And we did this on purpose because we wanted to see the effectiveness of such a prevention program, how it is practically administered or possible in a kindergarten routine and not just in a scientific environment. Later on, we tested these kids in first grade, second grade, and third grade, their calculation skills and IQ. How did the prevention look like? The tasks we were taking were partly from an intervention program from Krajewski and colleagues, Mengenzell and Zahlen, and the majority of the tasks came from an intervention called Math in Preschool by Rademacher. And we trained the kids for 11 weeks, 2 sessions per week, around 30 to 40 minutes per session. It was performed by the kindergarten teachers, and they had, they got a 2-day schooling beforehand. We offered a helpline. In the middle of the prevention, there was a supervision of a co-worker, and it was taking part in small groups of 3 to 4 kids. To the findings, here you see the results for the calculation skills in the first grade, second grade, and third grade. In blue, you can see the children that are at risk for dyscalculia who performed the prevention program in kindergarten, and in orange, the children at risk without prevention in kindergarten. And you can see that calculation skills were significantly higher in the group of children at risk who completed the intervention in kindergarten. We were also interested in the percentages of these children that really get a clinical diagnosis of dyscalculia later on. And this is what you see here. And in orange, again, the children at risk without prevention in kindergarten. here you see a significantly higher chance to get a clinical diagnosis later on of dyscalculia. So taken together, this part of the study was very promising in my point of view and showed that preschool training stimulating numerical competencies in very practical conditions first leads to long-term improvements of calculation skills and helped to prevent children at risk to develop dyscalculia. In the last part, I'd like to give you some further details about this longitudinal study and developmental trajectory. So we examined children from the 2nd to the 5th grade. Almost 3,000 kids were included in this study. And we tested them 3 times. And you see here, we have split up these kids in different subgroups. On the one hand, we had children with developmental dyscalculia. Then we had a group of kids with, we call it math learning disability. It's a bit a milder form of math problems compared to the dyscalculic group. And we had 2 control groups. The one here in green is a group of control children with normal IQ, and the second control group included children with an IQ below average. And then we re-investigated these children 3 years later and 2.5 years later then. First, to the prevalence of dyscalculia at the first time point. And here I have to say it's really dependent on what kind of diagnostic criteria you consider. If you take a very strict one, like 1.5 standard deviation below average of class level in math, plus a 1.5 standard discrepancy to IQ, we had a prevalence of 1.4%. And when we take a bit more liberal diagnostic criteria, as is found in the ICD-10 DSM-5, for instance, with math performance in the lowest 16% and a 1.5 standard deviation below average of class level in math, or a discrepancy to IQ, so it's not mandatory to have it, then it's much higher, it's around 11%. So I think this variation between 1 and 11% really shows it depends on what kind of clinical classification you rely your data on. What we found is that more girls were affected than boys, and this was particularly true for the group of kids with these severe math learning disorders. Our data corroborated that developmental dyscalculia is a persistent learning disorder. You can see here in the upper graph the kids who were in the group of the dyscalculics at the first time point, here to the second time point, about 75% still had severe math problems. We have no data here for the third time point because only 10 kids were left, and it makes no sense to make any statistic with 10 kids. And also for the milder form in the lower part here, you see that the majority still fulfills criteria of math problems with 54% and 57%. On the longitudinal trajectory, we were interested also in math performance in school, and as expected, you can see here, the math performance in school was highest for the control children with normal IQ, followed by the control children with IQ below average, and the lowest math performance showed the children with math learning disabilities, and this pattern remained stable over the whole development we have investigated. Next to this math performance in school, we also looked at school success at the last time point. And school success was defined in a combination of school grades, and not just math, it included math and language grades and so on, and the school form, where like higher schools like gymnasium were counted as higher school success. And The results here showed in these pyramids that the highest school success was achieved by control children with normal IQ, and it was significantly lower in children with math learning disabilities and in the control children with IQ below average. But what was kind of frustrating for me, or for them, I think as well, is that school success is similar between these two groups. So children with math learning disabilities had the same low school success compared to children with IQ below average. So in this last part, I showed you that the prevalence of dyscalculia varied between 1.4 and 11%, depending on the criteria you consider. More girls were affected than boys. And we corroborated the high persistency of math learning disorders with 75% after 3 years and 54 and 57 after 3 and 5.5 years. And we observed this negative development indicated by lower math performance in school and lower school success, which was similar to children with IQ below average. So when I can conclude the whole talk, I've shown you that prediction very early would be possible, and a prevention showed very good results, I would say, and can be helpful. And we corroborated this persistence character of dyscalculia, which should be prohibited. Unfortunately, in Switzerland at least, no prediction is done on a regular basis in kindergarten, and no prevention is really offered for children at an early stage. And when they have developed these math problems, usually they turn out in let's say after 3rd grade, and there's very little support. And we rather observe this negative development of these children, unfortunately. And I thank you for your attention. And when you're interested in more details about the results I've shown you, it's all published in the papers you see below. However, it's all in German because the goal was that these results are very important for the teachers in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. That's why we published them in German. However, I have summarized all of these data as well in a book chapter by Bilinguals and Avishai Hennig, where you can read all the results also in English. So I stop my screen, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Yes, I have a question. I'm wondering how you measured magnitude, understanding, and numerical knowledge in the first study. Very interesting talk, I should also say.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have tested numerical and magnitude understanding by different tasks. These were like, it included a battery of different numerical tasks like counting skills, non-symbolic magnitude comparison, symbolic magnitude comparison, and stuff like this. It's part of these existing evaluation batteries we have in Germany, where we have taken or selected just some sub-tasks that we thought were interesting. And then we just, evaluated it and decided that the lowest 10% of children that they belong to this risk group for later math learning disabilities.
Thank you.
Welcome.
It looks as though Anne is asking a question.
Yeah,
but
I think Anne, you have to unmute yourself. I couldn't hear you if you have a question.
Yes, no, I was just going to say that this was really interesting, and that if there are further questions, maybe people would ask you in chat. that we might, I just saw one presented, and we could now move on to Roy's talk. Thank you very, very much.
Can I just share the screen? I cannot share the file.
Pardon?
Just asking the MCLS. Can I just share the screen, not the file?
Yes, you can just
I'm
share the
sure,
screen. Yep.
Just share screen. Okay. Okay, can everyone see it?
Yep, looks
Can you
great.
hear me? Great. Okay. Okay, so thank you very much for organizing it, Anne. And it's really lovely to, even if it's remotely, to see familiar faces and the names of colleagues that sometimes you just see the pictures, but it still makes it a bit closer. And I have to say, unfortunately, I will not be able to be at the MCLS in Ghent. I'm going to miss your company and also good beer and chocolate and good science. So I'm going to tell you about personalizing neurostimulation to improve mathematical cognition. And when we submitted this talk as part of the symposium, it was before the paper appeared, but you can hear the talk and skip the paper, or if it's interesting, go and read the papers. So just before telling you about the work, just to provide some financial disclosure about the spin-out, patent, and consulting to some companies that have been on their scientific advisory boards. So the first thing that is probably not surprising is that not all brains are created equal. There are differences between brains that are due to genes, due to environment, but a lot of time it's something that we do not take into account in our research. And of course, there is more and more awareness of that when we try to see predictors of behavior, but we neglect it when it comes to interventions that usually use a one-size-fits-all approach. And I'm going to focus here on mathematical cognition, but the points, of course, that I'm putting forward are not just specific to maths. So when we look on the brain and want to link it to behavior, a lot of time we look on the side in the human brain, on the side that if we want to give the analogy, we're looking on activations in the brain, whether it is with EEG, fMRI, or NIRS. We're looking, for example, on connectivity or DTI, for example, tractography. And we think to some degree, something that is almost, you can say, you can term it an end of a process. We don't see the roots of these trajectories of these changes that occurs in the brain. Even if we look in the case of the children, we do not know what actually was the causes of that. And of course, something more interesting is to look on the seeds that have been planted before the trees arrive. And we think about the brain, what are, for example, the chemicals that can lead to some changes in the brain because they can influence a lot of processes in the brains, for example, excitation inhibition that could modulate plasticity. And we have now more and more work on that. I'm just showing you one study, but there are multiple by George here, you can see on the screen on the upper left side, who did his postdoc in my lab. And George was really interested in a technique called magnetic resonance spectroscopy, MRS. It's not something very novel, very new. It's been used quite a lot more for clinical sides, like, for example, seeing cases that relate to stroke or cancer and so forth. But more and more there is work that links that to behavior, whether in typical or atypical populations. And what George looked at is on nearly 300 participants that spans from the age of 6 to up to 25, so university students. And he looked on, used a cross-sectional longitudinal design in which he examined each participant twice, so time 1 and also around 1.5 to 2 years later. And he wanted to examine how it links to mathematical ability. So he ran some standardized mathematical achievement test. And what George found is that there is a link between neurochemicals in the brain, whether it is in the intraparietal sulcus or in the middle frontal gyrus, so the parietal cortex and the prefrontal cortex. There is a link between neurochemicals that are involved in excitation and inhibition, like glutamate and GABA, and mathematical achievements, whether it is at the same time, but also it can predict the mathematical achievements later on in life, so 1.5 to 2 years later. But it's also moderated by age. So you need to take into account age, and you could see here that there is, if someone is older, there is a different relationship between, for example, glutamate and mathematical achievements. And if someone is younger, and there is an opposite pattern in this case. And you could see also quite a lot of variability, right? So people have different levels of glutamate, for example, or GABA, and this is part of variability that it is very important to capture when we want to design interventions. So we talk about interventions. One of the modes of intervention that more and more people are using in mathematical cognition, and there was a symposium that Moshtaba organized around a month ago, is a transcranial electrical stimulation, in which we deliver a very low and painless current through electrodes that are placed on the scalp. And the idea is that this current is passed through the scalp and affects neural activity in a very subtle way, but it can increase the likelihood of inhibition or excitation of those neural populations. And there are different ways to do that. You can give it with methods that are called direct current stimulation, so TDCS, which is the most known, TRNS, which is actually something that a lot of people in mathematical cognition using more and more, and seems to be a promising method, or alternating current stimulation, in which we can deliver the current at a certain frequency in order to force the brain to operate at such frequency. Now, there are a lot of studies from different fields showing the effects of these methods on whether it is on BDNF, that is involved in neuroplasticity, GABA and glutamate that I mentioned before, but for example, on the Bolt signal, on hormones and neural oscillations. And there are some studies that also documented long-lasting behavioral effects. Now, what we want to do, based on previous findings, is to try to optimize stimulation. So not to deliver a one-size-fits-all approach, but to try to personalize that in order to tailor the parameters of the stimulation based on the individual characteristics. Now, of course, it's a very difficult mission when you need to take into account individual differences. So what we did here, we used a method called Bayesian optimization. So a method that we developed, which is called personalized Bayesian optimization, in which we deliver a certain set of parameters based on the individual characteristics. So in this example, we start to develop a model that with iterations, we provide, we start to explore the parameter space and provide different types of parameters. And this is just an example. Let's say we have a personalized dimension, which could be, in this case, it will be the mathematical abilities of the participant. And we have a stimulation parameters, and we can have multiple parameters, like, for example, what's the dose, okay, how much intensity we give, or the frequency that we want to give in terms of the stimulation. And we see what happened to the performance, if it's improving, if it's not improving, and we slowly try to optimize the stimulation in order to provide the best parameters based on the personalized characteristics until it leads to convergence and we then have a developed algorithm. So this is what Nienke, who you could see in the picture here, did as part of her work in my lab. So she had an arithmetic task. Participant had to solve equations and decide the right answer of the equation presented on the screen. And they did that while we deliver stimulation to both electrodes on the left and right, on the left prefrontal, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and above the left posterior parietal cortex. And we did it 3 times. So 3 times each participant received stimulation and we explore different types of parameters. What you could see here is the results showing that when we look on the mean of the participants, you find that the most optimal parameters will be stimulation at 20 hertz, around 20 hertz, and around 1 milliamp, which is something that most of the people would assume. But if you actually examine the results further, you see that those with lower arithmetic abilities require different types of parameters than those who have stronger mathematical abilities, who had, for example, require less intensive stimulation than them, but also at a different frequency. So this is, for example, will be at 40 hertz versus 20 hertz. You could see also that in terms of optimizing the stimulation with time, so the more we adding participants, the algorithm really learning. So this is the predicted of best performance, and you could see with time, there is more and more improvement in terms of the participants' performance. So as with time, we can see that the algorithm learns and is able to offer a more optimal set of parameters for the participants. This is just another graph showing that if you are not personalize the treatment, so this is the P here, if you just provide the stimulation without personalizing that, there is not so much effects when you're using this type of stimulation. So just to summarize, it's quite trivial, of course, but sometimes neglected, that we must understand and consider individual differences when we are looking on, in this case, mathematical abilities. And if we will have a better understanding of those factors, we would be able to improve interventions both in typical and atypical populations. Would like to thank my collaborators and current and previous lab members, as well as funding bodies. And I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very, very much. Are there any questions? Ilaria?
Yes, hello. Thank you for your talk. Very interesting. Nice seeing a lot of faces today. I have a question. What do you think it's actually doing, the difference in stimulation? Is it something like general cognitive processes versus specific processes? Why would different stimulations have different effects? So I think it's interesting, but what's happening?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I think it's something that we need. It's a very difficult with one study to try to capture everything and provide also the explanation, right? So here we're showing it's more of a method approach. What's happening, there are multiple reasons that we could see that. It could be the strategies that's been used differently by those who are have better arithmetic performance and those who have poor arithmetic performance. It might be things that related to more general cognitive abilities, like, for example, working memory that is also subserved by the left frontoparietal networks. So there are different reasons for that. But I think that sometimes when you just look on the mean, we do not know that, we do not capture these individual differences. So of course, we can run this experiment as an example again, but taking into account strategies. okay? Or you can, do that with working memory abilities as your personalized dimension, and see if you can, this is actually something we try to, you can transfer the same algorithm from arithmetic improvement to working memory improvement, okay? If it does, it actually means that what you target there is working memory abilities.
Okay, so thank you very, very much for a very interesting talk. Teresa, maybe you could ask your question in chat, and Roy might answer in chat, and anyone else with any questions, and we will proceed to Daniel Ansari's talk.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Anne. Thank you very much for organizing. It's great to be here, and looking forward to seeing many of you, hopefully in just over 6 weeks in Antwerp in Belgium. Really looking forward to that. Also, thanks very much to MCLS trainee for putting on this great series while we were unable to meet in person. So I want to take you on a sort of brief journey of a series of studies that my lab has been involved in over the last decade or so, trying to better understand how numerical symbols, specifically Arabic numerals, are represented in the human brain. So the first question I think we need to ask ourselves is, how do we actually go about studying the neural correlates of symbolic number processing? And perhaps the most frequently used approach is to ask people to engage in number comparison. And I think I don't need to explain this slide to anybody in this symposium, but just to go over briefly, you ask people which of two numbers is larger, and if you measure their brain activation using, for example, fMRI, what do you find is activation typically in and around the intraparietal sulcus? And what you also see is that this activation is modulated by the distance between the two numbers, or you might also use their ratio. So this is a fine paradigm, but it has some potential confounds that have been pointed out over the years. One of them is that, of course, number comparison involves decision-making, response selection. And Silke Goebel, in a paper some years ago now, showed that if you systematically control for response selection, you actually don't see any number-specific activation in the IPS. And if you think about this developmentally, or any kind of group comparisons as well, you might have reaction time differences between groups that would confound your group comparisons. So how can you overcome these two confounds, and there might be others, and still study the neural correlates of symbolic number processing? Well, one approach that you might take is a passive design, where you would passively present people with numbers and you repeat a certain number over and over again, which would be your so-called adaptation number. And what you would expect, given what we know about neurophysiology and about previous work with fMRI, is that the repetition will induce suppression in brain regions that are coding for the particular stimuli. So, for example, for the 6, you will have brain regions that are going to decrease in their activation, that are involved in the visual recognition of these symbols, but also in their semantic processing. And then you might introduce a new number, let's say 8, and you expect a certain amount of rebound effect. And what you might hypothesize, given what we know about the representation of number, you might hypothesize that this rebound effect is going to scale with ratio and distance. So you might expect that numbers closer to the adapted number are going to show less of a rebound effect, and those that are further apart are going to show a larger rebound effect. Now, in 2011, Caroline Notebaert and colleagues published a paper in JOCN in which they demonstrated the feasibility of this paradigm to study the neural representation of symbolic number. And as you can see from this figure here, what they found is this left lateralized activation in the intraparietal sulcus that, as you can see from the graph, roughly followed this distant-dependent tuning. In other words, you saw lowest activation for the habituation number, and then sort of parametric scaling as you move further away from that adaptation number. This study sort of provided a ground for a lot of our work over the last 10 years, where we wanted to dig a little bit deeper and ask, first of all, the question is, to what extent is this semantic processing? Because you might also expect that these distance-dependent these distance-dependent adaptation effects could be driven by perceptual similarity between the numbers. We know from Dale Cohen's work that something like the numerical distance effect can be explained by perceptual similarity. So one idea that Ian Holloway and I came up with was where we can look at whether this is semantic or perceptual by conducting a cross-linguistic study, and by exploiting the fact that Chinese has these ideographs that are numerical symbols, just like Indo-Arabic numerals. And but obviously, if you don't speak Chinese, you won't know the meaning of these symbols. So by contrasting people who know these symbols versus people who don't know these symbols, we can find out which areas of the brain are involved in the semantic processing, and perceptual processing should be equivalent between the groups. So we had two groups of participants, a group of 13 Chinese English bilinguals. They of course have a semantic representation of these ideographs. And then we had a comparison group of 13 English non-Chinese bilinguals who obviously have no semantic representations of these ideographs. And we adapted them both to the ideographs as well as to Arabic numerals. And what we found for Arabic numerals is a replication, essentially, of the Notabad findings, where you see in the left interparietal sulcus, you see this distance-dependent tuning for Arabic numerals, and it's pretty equivalent for the two groups. That's the two lines in your bar chart here. However, for the Chinese ideographs, what we found, there was no ratio tuning in the English non-Chinese bilinguals, and the English-Chinese bilinguals showed this ratio dependent tuning to the Arabic numerals in the right hemisphere. So this suggested to us that the parietal cortex is activated during symbolic number processing only when you are engaging semantic processing, because we didn't find any activation in the English non-Chinese bilinguals. We then also wanted to better understand whether there are any effects of modality, because previously this has only been studied in the visual modality. So Stefan Vogel, former graduate student who's now an associate professor at the University of Graz, looked at this by adapting people not only to visual numerals, but also to auditorily presented number words. And what you can see in this slide here is that we found very similar ratio-dependent tuning in the left interparietal sulcus for both number words presented in the auditory modality and Arabic numerals presented in the visual modality, suggesting at least to some extent that there may be an amodal representation of symbolic number in the left parietal cortex. One perhaps trivial question, but one question that I think you need to ask yourself whenever you find strongly lateralized activation is whether there could be any effect of handedness, given that fMRI studies are primarily conducted with right-handed individuals who learn to write with their right hand and learn to write Indo-Arabic numerals with their right hand. Perhaps the left lateralization is driven by handedness. Now, we investigated this some years ago with Celia Goffin in a registered report. And just to summarize, you can look at the details in the actual paper. We found no effect of handedness. So we found that both left and right-handed individuals show a left lateralized ratio-dependent tuning to Arabic numerals in the left parietal cortex. Another question you might ask yourself to better characterize these left lateralized representation of symbolic number is whether they reflect the processing of ordered sequences. And one way of doing this is to compare adaptation to numbers to adaptation to letters, because letters are also an ordered sequence. So perhaps this left lateralized or parietal tuning to Arabic numerals doesn't necessarily reflect only cardinality, but also ordinality, and perhaps ordinality in a way that isn't just specific to numbers. So Celia Goffin asked this question as part of her PhD thesis, and just to summarize this study that we published some years ago in human brain mapping, we were unable to provide evidence for a common ordinal processing response in the parietal cortex for letters and numbers. Instead, what we found was that there was some level of specificity for numbers, whereby only the numbers show distance-dependent adaptation in both the left and the right parietal cortex, but the letters did not. Now, developmentally, now that we have some more confidence that this region really is involved in symbolic number processing, we can ask ourselves whether there are any age-related changes. And for his PhD dissertation, Stefan Vogel asked this precise question in 20 children aged between 6 and 14 years of age. And he asked whether there's a correlation between this ratio-dependent adaptation to a symbolic number in the parietal cortex and chronological age. And what he found was that, first of all, in the left parietal cortex, there was a response to symbolic number, and this also correlated with chronological age. This suggested then that number change activation in the left parietal cortex correlates with age, perhaps suggesting that the left parietal cortex undergoes a process of developmental specialization for symbolic number. However, we did engage in a replication of this study, sort of going with the practice of questioning yourself, is this too good to be true? And Mike Slipensky and Celia Goffin conducted a rather painstaking replication, recruiting 40 children for this study, and we were unable to replicate the age-related effect that Stefan Vogel had uncovered. So we were still able to see the reliable ratio-dependent response to symbolic number in the parietal cortex, in this case bilaterally. But as you can see from the scatter plot on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, there was no age-related effect. So this leaves us to, with some questions about what really goes on developmentally, and do we actually see age-related changes at this level of processing? Because remember, this is very automatic, not intentional processing. This is not goal-directed processing. So we still have further work to do with this, but this is just to say that the age-related effect did not replicate. Now, you can also use fMRI-adaptation to investigate the differences and similarities between symbolic and non-symbolic representations of number in the brain. And in a recent study, Zach Hawes and Mariah Sokolowski came up with a sort of novel paradigm to do this, which we refer to as parallel adaptation. So the notion here is that you can adapt the brain, of course, to multiple dimensions of stimuli in parallel. So you can adapt to both symbolic and non-symbolic magnitude by, for example, representing 4 sixes. So you've got the symbolic magnitude 6 and you've got the non-symbolic magnitude 4. We had the only task here was to press a button whenever the digits turned from white to blue. So again, a purely passive paradigm. And then we had a number of deviants. So we had a symbolic deviant where we kept the non-symbolic numerical magnitude constant, but changed the symbolic numerical magnitude. A non-symbolic deviant where we held the symbolic magnitude constant, but changed the non-symbolic one, and we had always 2 levels of distance. And we were also interested in physical size, because there's some argument that physical size shares similarities in its brain representation with non-symbolic numerical magnitude. And just to give a brief overview of the findings, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions about them. Here is what we found. When you use this paradigm and you ask, well, which brain areas are showing a symbolic distance effect, we found left lateralized symbolic distance effect. For non-symbolic, it was right lateralized. And what's interesting here is that we see this strong overlap in the right parietal cortex between the non-symbolic distance effect and the physical size distance effect, suggesting perhaps that there's some similarities between symbolic and non-symbolic and physical size processing. We also did some representation similarity analysis to follow this up, and those confirm dissimilarity between symbolic and non-symbolic, and similarity between non-symbolic and physical size. So just to summarize, fMRI-adaptation I think is a useful tool to study symbolic number processing in the brain, but I'm starting to have my doubts about this, because I can share some important caveat at the end if there's time. My graduate student Amy Alvarez has done some work on this that suggests that there might be some issues. It reveals left lateralization for Arabic numerals. It reflects, in our view, semantic, not perceptual processing. To some extent, we've established that it's modality independent, but we still need to do fully crossover designs to really establish that. It's not related to handedness, and it is not related to the general processing of ordered sequences. And at present, the developmental changes that we previously thought we'd captured are unclear because we failed to replicate our own work. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. I'd like to thank all those that funded the work, and most importantly, those who did the work. So I know we're probably already over time, but maybe I can answer some questions if people want to stick around.
Thank you very, very much. Are there any questions?
Right.
If not, I
Thank
would
you.
like to say thank you very, very much to all of you, and very, very interesting.
I think Roy had one question.
Oh, Roy, have you a question?
Thank you, Daniel, for a really great talk. I just wonder, in the case of the lack of replication, great that you're trying to replicate those findings. Do you think it might relate to differences between the samples in their arithmetic abilities?
That's a really great question. So even in the first study, we didn't find an association between individual differences in math abilities and adaptation effects. Neither did we in the second study.
I'm not talking about the adaptation, I'm talking about the specialization.
Yes. What I'm saying is in both those studies there is no association between the math abilities and the brain activation. I don't know whether the distributions of the samples differ with regards to ability. I would have to look at that. Yeah, it could be. It could be. We haven't checked that.
Thank you.
I personally think it's more because even 40 isn't enough. Really, to capture individual differences, we need hundreds, and that's a bit the conundrum I think we all find ourselves in now, is that fMRI, the sample sizes that we got away with, I would say, so we will no longer be able to get away with, or we will not be able to make good inferences from. Oh, Bert is asking in the chat the caveats, and several other people like to know as well. So here's the, we try. So when you look at ratio-dependent tuning effects, what you would expect, your prediction for a representational similarity analysis would be that you should find that numbers that are close together are more correlated in terms of their patterns of brain activation. Now, not only did we not find that, but we also found that the data are adaptation data are extremely noisy. So they're very unsuited actually to testing these kinds of hypotheses about representational overlap. So that's kind of the problem, that we see something that looks plausible. We see these ratio-dependent adaptation effects that look like we could interpret them as though they reflect overlapping representations. But when we want to apply the tools to actually test those overlapping representations, we're left with a picture that suggests that the paradigm is actually unsuited for doing so. So honestly, I don't know what the solution is at this point in time, but I think we need to have a rethink around that, and we need to really ask ourselves, well, what do these adaptation effects really mean? I mean, just because we have a plausible explanation, it doesn't mean that we're correct about it.
Oh, thank you very, very much indeed. And I hope we will all stay in touch. I'd like to hear more about all your very interesting work. And thank you all very, very much for speaking, and thank you all very, very much for attending.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you all next Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern, 4 p.m.
next week.
British time.
Thanks.
Thanks, Anne.